Jack Miller had been walking through empty alien settlements for so long that he'd stopped counting the days. The purple sand of Kelrose 7 crunched under his military boots with every step, a sound that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The war was over. Everyone else had gone home. But Jack stayed behind, volunteering for extended patrol duty on this godforsaken rock at the edge of known space. Back on Earth, there was nothing waiting for him except empty rooms and questions he couldn't answer. His squad was gone. All of them. Danny, Rodriguez, Thompson, and little Garrett, who just turned 23 before the final assault. Jack was the only one who made it out, and he still couldn't figure out why. Why him? Why not Garrett, who had a baby daughter he'd never even met? The guilt ate at him like acid, burning away everything that used to make him feel human. The alien planet didn't help. If anything, it made everything worse. Kelrose 7 was teeming with life, but it was all wrong. Creatures with too many legs skittered across rocks. Things with membrane wings and hollow bones swooped overhead, making sounds like broken violins. At night, glowing worms crawled out of the ground, pulsing with bioluminescent light that hurt his eyes. Everything about this place felt hostile and alien, reminding him constantly that he didn't belong here. Jack hated the wildlife most of all. Not because they were dangerous, though some were. He hated them because they were alive and thriving while his friends were dead. He hated how they moved without fear, how they existed in this world like they had every right to be here. One evening, as Jack sat outside the mess hall eating a tasteless ration pack, a small lizard-like creature approached him. It had 6 legs and crystalline scales that caught the fading light. The thing tilted its head at him, almost like it was curious. Jack threw a rock at it. The creature squeaked and scurried away into the rocks. He felt nothing. Not satisfaction, not regret. Just the same hollow emptiness that had lived inside his chest for months. His lieutenant, a graying man named Davis, had pulled him aside after that incident. Davis had kind eyes, the sort of eyes that had seen too much but still tried to care. He'd asked Jack if everything was okay, if maybe he needed to talk to someone, if perhaps it was time to rotate back to Earth. Jack had looked him straight in the eye and lied. Said he was fine. Said he preferred the quiet out here. Said he was handling things just fine, sir, no need to worry. Davis didn't believe him. Jack could tell. But the lieutenant also knew better than to push too hard. Some wounds needed time, and sometimes time meant staying as far away from home as possible. The days blurred together. Wake up. Run perimeter checks. Scan for thermal signatures. File reports. Sleep. Repeat. Jack barely spoke to the other soldiers stationed at the outpost. They tried at first, inviting him to card games or to watch movies on someone's tablet. After enough cold shoulders, they stopped trying. Jack preferred it that way. People asked questions. People wanted you to be okay. It was easier to be alone. The crystalline forests were his favorite patrol route, if he could call anything on this planet a favorite. The trees weren't really trees, but tall mineral formations that grew in spiral patterns, refracting light into rainbow patterns across the forest floor. It was almost beautiful in an alien sort of way. At least it was quiet there, away from the chittering and howling of the wildlife near the settlement. On this particular afternoon, Jack was making his usual rounds when he heard something different. A sound that didn't belong. It was high-pitched and desperate, coming from somewhere off the main path. Chirping. Almost like birds, but not quite. The sound repeated over and over, getting weaker each time. Jack stopped walking. His training said investigate any unusual sounds. His instinct said keep moving, finish the patrol, go back to base. This planet was full of weird noises. This was probably just another disgusting alien creature making a fuss about something that didn't concern him. He stood there for a long moment, listening to those desperate chirps echoing through the crystal formations. They sounded scared. They sounded alone. Jack closed his eyes and saw Garrett's face, heard Danny's laugh, remembered Thompson's terrible jokes. He turned toward the sound. Later he wouldn't be able to explain why. Maybe it was muscle memory from his training. Maybe it was something else, some tiny spark of the person he used to be before the war turned him into this hollow thing wearing Jack Miller's face. The chirping led him off the path, through a narrow gap between 2 large crystal formations, to where the ground had collapsed into a small cavern. The opening was just wide enough for him to squeeze through. Jack clicked on his shoulder light and descended into the darkness, following sounds that were growing weaker by the minute. He told himself he was just doing his job. He told himself it didn't matter what he found down there. He told himself a lot of things as he climbed down into that cave, none of them true. Jack's shoulder light cut through the darkness as he dropped down into the cavern. The air smelled different here, thick and musky with something he couldn't identify. His boots hit uneven ground, and he steadied himself against the rough stone wall. The chirping sounds were clearer now, coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. They were weaker than before, almost giving up. He moved forward carefully, sweeping his light across the cavern floor. Rocks and debris were scattered everywhere, like something had caused a collapse recently. Then his light caught something that made him freeze. Scales. Iridescent scales that shimmered even in the dim glow of his flashlight. They were attached to small bodies, 3 of them huddled together in a shallow depression in the rock. Jack moved closer, and his light revealed creatures unlike anything he'd seen on Kelrose 7. They looked like tiny dragons from old Earth legends, no bigger than house cats. Their scales shifted colors from deep blue to purple to green as his light moved over them. They had small folded wings pressed against their sides, ridged backs with delicate spines, and large eyes that blinked up at him with what looked like hope. The smallest one made a sound, a pitiful chirp that tugged at something Jack thought had died months ago. Then he saw why they were making such desperate noises. A few feet away, partially buried under a massive pile of collapsed rock, was an adult version of these creatures. It was easily the size of a small shuttle, with powerful limbs and wings that would have been magnificent if they weren't crushed and broken. The mother, Jack realized. She died protecting her babies. His first thought was to leave. These were just animals. Alien animals at that. They belonged to this world, not to him. This wasn't his problem. He had enough problems of his own without adding 3 alien creatures to the list. Jack turned to go, his duty done. He'd investigated the sound. That was enough. Then the smallest hatchling moved. It crawled toward him, dragging itself across the rough stone with determination that seemed impossible for something so tiny and weak. It reached his boot and pressed its small head against the leather, making sounds that reminded Jack painfully of a puppy he'd had as a kid. Max. A golden retriever who'd followed him everywhere, who'd slept at the foot of his bed every night, who'd waited by the door every day until Jack came home from school. Max had died while Jack was on his first deployment. His mom had called to tell him, her voice gentle, knowing it would hurt. Jack had cried in his bunk that night, muffling the sounds with his pillow so his squad mates wouldn't hear. That was years ago, back when he could still cry, back when he could still feel things. He looked down at the tiny creature pressing against his boot. Its scales were dull, not shimmering like they should be. Starvation. Dehydration. They wouldn't last another day down here in the dark. Maybe not another hour. Jack swore under his breath. This was stupid. This was against about a dozen regulations. This was going to cause problems he didn't need. But his hands were already moving, unslinging his backpack, opening it wide. He knelt down and carefully scooped up the smallest hatchling. It was light, too light, and its scales felt smooth and warm under his fingers. The creature made a small sound, almost like relief, and curled against his chest. The other 2 hatchlings watched him with those large, intelligent eyes. Jack reached for them too, gathering all 3 into his pack, arranging them as gently as he could. They huddled together inside, their small bodies trembling. One of them, slightly larger than the others, looked up at him and made a trilling sound that seemed almost like a question. Jack didn't have an answer. The climb back up to the surface was harder with the extra weight, but Jack managed. When he emerged into the fading daylight of Kelrose 7, the hatchlings blinked at the brightness, their eyes adjusting. Jack looked around to make sure no one was nearby, then started the long walk back to the outpost, taking the routes he knew would be empty this time of day. Getting them into his quarters without being seen required timing and luck. Jack waited until the evening shift change, when everyone was either in the mess hall or heading to their bunks. He slipped through the side entrance and made it to his private room without encountering anyone. Only senior personnel got private quarters, one of the few perks of his rank that Jack actually appreciated right now. He emptied his pack onto his bunk, and the 3 hatchlings tumbled out onto the gray military blanket. They looked even smaller in the harsh light of his room. Jack had no idea what to feed them. He pulled up the base's xenobiology database on his tablet and searched for anything that looked like these creatures. It took him 20 minutes of scrolling through entries, but he finally found them. Dracovians. Native to Kelrose 7. Apex predators. Extremely rare, mostly nocturnal, poorly studied. Status: protected species. Diet: carnivorous. Great. He just smuggled protected alien predators onto a military base. The database didn't have much information about their care, especially as hatchlings. Jack read that they were fast-growing, highly intelligent, and had never been successfully domesticated by any species. The few studies that existed were mostly observational, done from a distance. No one really knew much about them because they were so hard to find. Jack opened one of his ration packs and pulled out the synth meat portion. It looked disgusting as usual, but it was protein. He tore off a small piece and offered it to the smallest hatchling. The creature sniffed it cautiously, then snatched it from his fingers and swallowed it whole. Within seconds, all 3 hatchlings were eating from his hand, making small satisfied sounds as they devoured the food. He fed them 2 more ration packs before they seemed satisfied. Then he set up a small water dish using his canteen cup, and they drank eagerly, splashing water everywhere. When they were finally done, they looked at him with what seemed like gratitude. The smallest one crawled up his arm and settled on his shoulder, curling around his neck like a scaly scarf. Jack sat on his bunk, feeling the small creature's heartbeat against his skin. This was insane. He was a soldier, not a wildlife rehabilitator. He was depressed and broken and barely holding himself together. He had no business taking care of anything, let alone 3 alien creatures that would probably grow up to be dangerous predators. But as he sat there in the quiet of his room with 3 small lives depending on him for the first time in months, Jack felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't happiness exactly. It wasn't hope. But it was something other than the crushing emptiness that had lived there since the war ended. It was responsibility. It was purpose. It was something that needed him to keep going. He named them that night. The smallest one on his shoulder became Ember, because her scales glowed warm orange when the light hit them right. The medium-sized one with the brightest blue scales became Storm. The largest, with scales that shifted between deep purple and black, became Blaze. Jack lay back on his bunk, and within minutes, all 3 hatchlings had climbed onto his chest, forming a small pile of scales and wings and steady breathing. For the first time in 6 months, Jack Miller fell asleep without seeing his dead friends' faces. Instead, he dreamed of 3 small creatures who needed him to survive. The first week with the hatchlings changed everything. Jack had expected them to be work, another burden to carry, but they turned out to be nothing like he imagined. They followed him everywhere his quarters allowed, their small claws clicking on the metal floor as they waddled behind him. When he sat at his desk to file reports, they climbed up his legs and perched on his shoulders, watching the screen with fascination. When he tried to do push-ups, they thought it was a game and crawled underneath him, chirping excitedly. Ember, the smallest, never strayed far from Jack's side. She had claimed his left shoulder as her personal spot and would chirp indignantly if either of her siblings tried to take it. Storm was the curious one, always investigating every corner of the room, every object, every sound. She discovered that Jack's boots made excellent hiding spots and would squeeze herself inside them, then pop her head out and trill triumphantly. Blaze was the calm one, the thinker. He'd watch his sisters play while staying close to Jack, as if understanding that his role was to be steady and reliable. Jack found himself talking to them. At first, it felt ridiculous having conversations with alien creatures who couldn't possibly understand him. But they listened. They tilted their heads when he spoke, their large eyes focused on his face like they were trying to understand every word. And slowly, Jack started telling them things he'd never told anyone. He told them about Danny, who could make anyone laugh even in the worst situations. About Rodriguez, who kept a photo of his wife in his helmet and kissed it before every mission. About Thompson, who was scared of spiders but faced down enemy fire without flinching. About Garrett, who'd shown everyone pictures of his baby daughter until they'd all memorized her face. He told them about the last battle, the one that had taken everything from him. The explosion that came from nowhere. The chaos and smoke and screaming. How he tried to reach them, tried to help, but there was too much fire and too much blood, and by the time the dust cleared, he was alone. He told them how he couldn't understand why he'd survived when better men had died. The hatchlings didn't judge him. They just pressed closer, their warm bodies a comfort against the cold emptiness he'd been carrying. Ember would nuzzle his neck when his voice broke. Storm would chirp softly, a sound that felt like sympathy. Blaze would rest his head on Jack's chest, right over his heart, as if trying to hold the broken pieces together. Jack's bunkmate, a guy named Travis from Texas, noticed the change first. Travis had tried being friendly when Jack first arrived, inviting him to poker games and meals, but Jack had shut him down so many times that Travis had eventually given up. Now Travis caught Jack smiling at something on his tablet during breakfast. "You win the lottery or something, Miller?" Travis asked, genuine surprise in his voice. Jack looked up, realizing he'd been grinning at a video he'd recorded of Storm trying to catch her own tail. "Something like that," he said, and Travis nearly dropped his coffee in shock at getting an actual response. But keeping the hatchlings secret was getting harder. They were growing fast, already twice the size they'd been when Jack found them. They needed more food, more space, more stimulation. Jack had started taking them out at night, carrying them in his pack to an abandoned storage building where they could stretch their wings and practice flying. Watching them figure out how to use their wings was like watching miracles happen in real time. Then Ember got sick. Jack woke up one morning to find her listless and hot to the touch, her scales dull and her breathing shallow. Panic hit him like a physical blow. He pulled up the xenobiology database, searching frantically for information about Dracovian illnesses, but there was almost nothing. Most of the entries just said unknown or requires further study. Jack spent his entire day shift distracted, checking his tablet every few minutes for any scrap of information. He cross-referenced symptoms with other reptilian species, with avian species, with anything that might help. He skipped meals. He ignored Travis asking if he was okay. All he could think about was Ember lying on his bunk, too weak to lift her head. That night, Jack did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He broke into the medical bay's pharmaceutical storage. He knew it was wrong. He knew he could face disciplinary action, maybe even court-martial. But Ember needed antibiotics, and Jack would face a firing squad before he'd let her die because of regulations. He found broad-spectrum antibiotics used for unknown alien pathogens. The dosing information was for creatures much larger than Ember, so Jack had to calculate carefully, converting her weight and estimated metabolism. He crushed the pills, mixed them with water, and used a dropper to get the medicine into her mouth. She fought weakly at first, then seemed to understand he was trying to help. Jack sat with her all night. He held her small body against his chest, feeling every labored breath, every shiver. Storm and Blaze curled up next to their sister, as if their presence alone could help her heal. Jack found himself praying to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. He promised everything he could think of. Just let her live. Please. I've lost enough. Don't take her too. Around 3 in the morning, Ember's fever broke. Her breathing eased. Her scales began to shimmer again just slightly. She opened her eyes and looked at Jack, then made a small chirp that sounded like relief. Jack felt tears on his face and realized he was crying for the first time since the war ended. But these weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude, of connection, of feeling something other than numbness. The next morning, a woman Jack didn't recognize showed up at his door during inspection. She was civilian, wearing a xenobiology research badge that identified her as Dr. Rebecca Walsh. She was in her 40s with gray streaking her dark hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Specialist Miller," she said calmly. "I understand you've been accessing the xenobiology database quite extensively. Also, the medical bay reported missing antibiotics. And you've been seen carrying a rather heavy pack to abandoned sectors at unusual hours." Jack's stomach dropped. This was it. He was caught. They'd take the hatchlings away, probably put them in some research facility, and Jack would go back to being empty and alone. Dr. Walsh stepped into his room without waiting for an invitation. Her eyes went straight to the bunk where 3 small dragon-like creatures were currently wrestling over a piece of synth meat. Her expression went from professional to absolutely stunned. "Are those," she said slowly, "are those Dracovians? Young ones? In your quarters?" Jack stood at attention, preparing for the worst. "Yes, ma'am." Dr. Walsh walked closer to the bunk. Ember, always the boldest, chirped at her curiously. The scientist extended her hand slowly and Ember sniffed it, then allowed herself to be touched. Dr. Walsh's hands were gentle, professional, examining Ember with obvious expertise. "Do you have any idea," Dr. Walsh said quietly, "how impossible this is supposed to be?" Jack said nothing. Dracovians don't bond with other species. They don't allow themselves to be touched. They certainly don't let anyone get close enough to raise their young. Dr. Walsh looked at Jack with something like wonder. "Yet here you are with 3 healthy hatchlings who are clearly imprinted on you. They trust you completely. Are you going to report me?" Jack asked, his voice flat. Dr. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, watching as Storm climbed up Jack's leg and settled on his shoulder. "These creatures bond for life with whoever raises them," she finally said. "Separating them from you now would likely kill them. They'd stop eating, stop responding. It's happened with other bonding species." Jack felt hope flutter in his chest, fragile as a candle flame. "But," Dr. Walsh continued, "regulations are regulations. I should report this immediately." She paused, then smiled slightly. "However, I seem to have misplaced my report forms. Might take me a few weeks to find them. Maybe longer." Jack stared at her. "Why would you help me?" Dr. Walsh looked at the 3 hatchlings, then back at Jack. "Because sometimes," she said, "the most important discoveries happen by accident. And because those creatures have done something for you that all the therapy and medication in the galaxy couldn't manage. You're alive again, Specialist Miller. Anyone can see that." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. I'll help you. Proper nutrition information, health monitoring, everything you need. But you have to promise me something. If this works, if they continue to thrive, I want to study this bond. Not in a lab. Here with you. The galaxy needs to know this is possible. Jack looked at Ember on his shoulder, at Storm investigating Dr. Walsh's boots, at Blaze watching everything with calm intelligence. Deal, he said. For the first time since the war ended, Jack Miller had something worth protecting. And he'd found it in the last place he ever expected, in 3 small alien creatures who'd chosen him when he'd given up on choosing anything at all. Dr. Walsh kept her word. She started visiting Jack's quarters regularly, bringing specialized nutrition supplements and monitoring equipment. She taught him how to read the hatchlings' body language, how to spot early signs of illness, and what their different vocalizations meant. Under her guidance and the proper care, Ember, Storm, and Blaze grew at an incredible rate. Within a month, they'd outgrown Jack's bunk. Within 2 months, they were the size of large dogs. Their scales had become brilliant and lustrous, shifting through colors that seemed impossible. Their wings had developed fully, and they'd started making short flights around Jack's quarters, knocking over equipment and causing minor chaos that Jack found himself laughing about. Real laughter. The kind he'd forgotten he was capable of. But it wasn't just their physical growth that amazed everyone. It was their intelligence. Storm learned to open doors by watching Jack do it once. Blaze figured out how to manipulate the light controls, turning them on and off until Jack taught him that nighttime meant lights off. Ember developed a vocabulary of sounds that clearly meant different things. One chirp for hungry. Another for wanting to go outside. A third for alerting Jack to danger. That intelligence saved Jack's life on a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other. He was running a standard patrol route with the hatchlings hidden in an old supply cart he'd modified with air holes. They were getting too big to hide easily, but Jack couldn't bear to leave them behind anymore. They were part of him now, as essential as breathing. He'd just passed the southern perimeter fence when he heard engines. Not the usual supply shuttles. These were rougher, louder. Wrong. Jack crouched behind a rock formation and pulled out his scanner. 3 ships, unmarked, descending fast toward the settlement. Raiders. Kelrose 7 was remote enough that criminal groups sometimes tried their luck, hoping to find supplies or equipment they could steal and sell. Usually, the base defenses were enough to scare them off. But these ships were heavily armed and they were coming in hot. Jack hit his comm base. This is Miller. We've got incoming hostiles, southern approach, 3 ships, armed and... The explosion cut him off. One of the raider ships had fired on the communication tower, and Jack watched it crumble in a shower of sparks and twisted metal. His comm went dead. The base was under attack and he was cut off from backup. The supply cart shook as the hatchlings sensed danger. They weren't hatchlings anymore, Jack realized. In just 2 months, they'd become adolescents, each nearly 100 pounds of muscle and scale and sharp intelligence. Blaze pushed his way out of the cart, followed immediately by his sisters. All 3 looked at Jack, then toward the settlement where gunfire had started to echo. No, Jack said firmly. You 3 stay here. This isn't your fight. Ember chirped at him, a sound he'd learned meant disagreement. Storm spread her wings, now easily a 12-foot span, and made a low rumbling sound in her chest. Blaze simply positioned himself between Jack and the direction of the gunfire, making his intention crystal clear. They weren't leaving him. Jack made a decision that went against every regulation in the book. Okay, he said. But you follow my lead. You stay together. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood. All 3 Dracovians made the same clicking sound that Jack had learned meant agreement. They understood him. Not just the tone of his voice but the actual meaning behind his words. Dr. Walsh had been right. These creatures weren't just intelligent. They were something more. The raiders had landed near the main complex, probably 20 or 30 of them armed with military-grade weapons. Jack's fellow soldiers were pinned down, outgunned and caught by surprise. He could see Travis trying to organize a defense from behind an overturned transport vehicle, but they were losing ground fast. Jack didn't have a plan. He just had 3 Dracovians who trusted him and a desperate need to help his people. He signaled to Blaze, Storm, and Ember, and they moved as one unit toward the combat zone. They didn't run in blindly. They used the crystal formations for cover, moving with a coordination that seemed impossible for creatures so young. They were working as a team, communicating with sounds too low for Jack to hear, but clearly understanding each other perfectly. When they reached the edge of the firefight, Jack saw his opportunity. The raiders were focused entirely on the pinned-down soldiers, their backs exposed. He pointed toward a group of 5 raiders positioned behind some cargo containers. There, he whispered. Fast and quiet. What happened next would be talked about for years across the Galactic Council. Blaze went high while Storm and Ember went low. Blaze dropped from above like a missile, his bulk slamming into 2 raiders and knocking them unconscious before they could even shout. Storm swept in from the side, her tail whipping around to disarm 3 raiders in one fluid motion. Ember, smaller but faster, darted between them, her precise strikes targeting weapons and weak points in their armor. Within 15 seconds, 5 armed raiders were on the ground, disarmed and neutralized, and not one of them had been seriously injured. The Dracovians had pulled their strikes. They could have killed easily, but they'd chosen to disable instead. They'd understood the objective wasn't to kill, but to protect. Travis saw it happen from his position. His jaw actually dropped open. What in the hell? The remaining raiders noticed their fallen comrades and turned their weapons toward the Dracovians. That was their mistake. Jack had learned over the past 2 months that these creatures could move fast when they needed to. But he'd never seen them truly motivated. Not like this. Not when they were protecting their family. Storm took to the air, her wings creating downdrafts that kicked up dust and debris, obscuring the raiders' vision. Blaze charged straight through their line, scattering them like bowling pins. Ember coordinated it all, her sharp calls directing her siblings with tactical precision that would have impressed any military commander. They moved like a single organism, anticipating each other's actions, covering each other's vulnerabilities. The raiders broke. Professional criminals knew when they were outmatched, and fighting 3 coordinated alien predators wasn't in their job description. They retreated to their ships, leaving their wounded behind, and took off with engines screaming. The entire attack had lasted less than 10 minutes. In the aftermath, as the dust settled and the adrenaline faded, Jack stood surrounded by his fellow soldiers. All of them were staring at Ember, Storm, and Blaze, who had arranged themselves protectively around Jack. Travis approached slowly, his weapon lowered but his eyes wide with disbelief. "Miller," he said carefully, "do you want to explain why you have 3 massive alien predators who just saved all our lives?" Before Jack could answer, a shuttle descended from orbit. Not a military shuttle. This one bore the insignia of the Galactic Council. Jack's heart sank. News traveled fast, apparently. The shuttle landed, and out stepped an alien Jack had only seen in briefings. Ambassador Trell, a Valorian with blue-gray skin and 4 arms, each currently holding a data pad. Specialist Jack Miller, Trell said in perfect English, his translator device barely needed. "I am here about your Dracovians." Jack stood straight, ready to face whatever came next. Ember chirped softly from his shoulder, where she'd climbed despite now weighing close to 100 pounds. Storm and Blaze pressed close to his legs. Whatever happened, they'd face it together. But Trell wasn't frowning. He was staring at the Dracovians with something that looked like reverence. "Do you understand what you have accomplished?" he asked quietly. Dracovians once partnered with the Karathi civilization, 10,000 years ago. They were companions, protectors, friends. When the Karathi died out from a plague, the Dracovians retreated into isolation. We thought that bond was lost forever, that no species would ever connect with them again. He gestured to Ember, Storm, and Blaze. Yet here stands a human who has achieved the impossible. These creatures have chosen you, bonded with you, and fight alongside you with coordination that suggests deep understanding and trust. Do you know how rare this is in the galaxy? How precious? Jack looked at his 3 companions, then back at Trell. "They're not just animals," he said firmly. "They're family." Trell's expression softened. "Yes," he agreed. "I can see that. Which is why the Galactic Council has a proposal for you. We want you to become the first official Dracovian handler. We want to establish a program here on Kelros 7, rescuing orphan Dracovians and pairing them with humans who need purpose and healing. Just as you have done." Jack felt something settle in his chest. Not quite peace, but something close. Purpose. Direction. A reason to keep going that was bigger than just himself. He looked at Travis, who was grinning like an idiot. At Dr. Walsh, who had appeared from somewhere and was nodding encouragement. At the other soldiers who'd watched him go from a broken, isolated man to someone who just saved all their lives with 3 alien creatures nobody thought could be tamed. "On one condition," Jack said. "Any human who wants to be part of this program has to actually care. Has to see these creatures as more than tools or weapons. They're individuals. They're intelligent. They deserve respect." Trell's 4 hands moved in what Jack had learned was a Valorian gesture of agreement. "Those," he said, "are exactly the kind of humans we are looking for." Jack stood in front of what used to be an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the settlement. 6 months ago, this place had been nothing but rusted metal and broken dreams. Now it was home to the Kelros 7 Dracovian Sanctuary, the first of its kind in the known galaxy. The sign above the entrance read simply, New Beginnings, in 3 languages, including one that used symbols the Dracovians themselves could recognize. Inside, the space had been transformed. Open flight areas stretched toward reinforced ceiling panels. Heated rocks provided comfortable resting spots. Water features bubbled in the corners, and the whole place smelled like the mineral-rich soil the Dracovians preferred. But more importantly, it was filled with life. Ember soared overhead, her wingspan now reaching an impressive 20 feet. Her scales had deepened into rich oranges and reds, and she moved through the air with grace that took Jack's breath away. Storm was below, teaching a newly rescued hatchling how to glide properly, her patient chirps echoing through the space. Blaze rested on his favorite heated rock, watching everything with those intelligent eyes, always alert, always aware. They weren't Jack's only companions anymore. In the 6 months since Ambassador Trell's proposal, 12 more Dracovians had been rescued from various situations across Kelros 7. Some were orphans like his 3 had been. Others had been injured or trapped. Each one found their way to the sanctuary, and each one eventually bonded with a human who needed them just as much. Travis was one of the first volunteers. The big Texan had approached Jack 3 days after the raid, nervously asking if he could help with the Dracovians. Jack had been skeptical at first. Travis was loud and boisterous, the kind of guy who seemed too carefree to understand what these creatures needed. But he'd been wrong. Travis had bonded with a Dracovian named Ash, a scarred male who'd been caught in a rockslide. The two of them were inseparable now, and Travis had admitted to Jack one night that taking care of Ash had helped him deal with trauma from his own past that he'd never talked about before. Then there was Kelly, a combat medic who'd seen too much death and couldn't sleep without nightmares. She'd bonded with twin Dracovians, Dawn and Dusk, and something about caring for them had given her peace she couldn't find anywhere else. She told Jack that having something depend on her for life instead of desperately trying to save lives that were already slipping away had changed everything for her. The program grew organically. Word spread through military channels, then to civilian sectors and eventually across the entire galaxy. Humans, it turned out, had a particular gift for bonding with Dracovians. Something about human empathy, human stubbornness, and human willingness to see past the alien and frightening to find connection underneath. Dr. Walsh had written 3 papers about it already, and universities across multiple planets were studying the phenomenon. But for Jack, it wasn't about the science or the fame. It was about the people. Broken people who walked through the sanctuary doors carrying the same emptiness he'd carried for so long. Veterans who couldn't adjust to civilian life. People who'd lost everything and didn't know how to start over. Individuals who felt disconnected from the world and everyone in it. One afternoon, a young guy named Kyle showed up. He couldn't have been more than 22, with haunted eyes that Jack recognized immediately. Kyle had been part of a mining operation that got attacked. He was the sole survivor, pulled from the rubble 3 days after everyone thought he was dead. He hadn't spoken more than a few words since, according to his file. Jack didn't push. He just brought Kyle into the sanctuary and let him observe. Kyle sat on a bench for hours, watching the Dracovians fly and play and interact. Ember, always the most perceptive, eventually wandered over to him. She was massive now, easily 500 pounds of muscle and scale, but she approached Kyle with the gentleness of a creature who understood pain. She laid her head on Kyle's lap and just waited. After a long moment, Kyle's hand moved to touch her scales. Then he started crying. Not quiet tears, but deep, body-shaking sobs that he'd probably been holding in for months. Ember stayed perfectly still, letting him break apart, offering nothing but presence and acceptance. When Kyle finally stopped, he looked at Jack with red eyes. "Can I?" His voice was rough from disuse. "Can I come back tomorrow?" "You can come back every day," Jack told him. "For as long as you need." Kyle did come back. Every single day. Within a month, a young female Dracovian named Spark had bonded with him. Within 2 months, Kyle was smiling again. Within 3, he was helping other new volunteers, sharing his story, showing them that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Stories like Kyle's happened over and over. The sanctuary became more than just a place for Dracovians. It became a place where humans could be broken and find their way back to wholeness. Where species that should have been incompatible found understanding. Where the galaxy learned that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their tactics, but their capacity to care about creatures completely different from themselves. The Galactic Council took notice. Ambassador Trell visited regularly, always amazed by what he saw. Other species started attempting similar programs with different creatures on different worlds, with varying degrees of success. But nothing quite matched what happened on Kelros 7, where humans and Dracovians had formed bonds that seemed to defy logic. One evening, Jack sat outside the sanctuary watching the sunset paint Kelros 7's sky in shades of purple and gold. Blaze was beside him, now fully grown and magnificent. Storm and Ember were flying patterns overhead, their silhouettes dark against the colorful sky. His tablet buzzed with a message. It was from his brother Tom back on Earth. Jack had finally called him 4 months ago, the first real conversation they'd had in over a year. He told Tom everything. About the squad, about the guild, about finding the hatchlings, about discovering purpose in the last place he'd expected. Tom had listened without judgment, then asked when he could visit. That visit had happened last month, and Tom had spent a week at the sanctuary, amazed by everything Jack had built. The message read simply, "Dad would be proud of you." "I know I am. You found your way back, Jack. That's what matters." Jack felt emotion tighten his throat. Their father had been a veterinarian, someone who dedicated his life to caring for animals. He died when Jack was 16, but his lessons had stayed. Treat all creatures with respect. Understand that different doesn't mean lesser. Find purpose in service. Jack had forgotten those lessons for a while, lost in grief and war and guilt. But somehow, 3 small hatchlings had helped him remember. "Hey, Miller." Travis's voice called from the sanctuary entrance. "We've got another rescue coming in. Female about 6 months old, found near the northern canyons. You want to meet her?" Jack stood, Blaze rising beside him. "Yeah," he called back. "We'll be right there." As he walked back toward the sanctuary with Blaze at his side, Jack thought about the man he'd been 6 months ago. That hollow shell who hated everything alien, who pushed away connection, who couldn't see a reason to keep going. That man would never have believed this could be his life now. Leading a program that helped both humans and Dracovians heal. Making a real difference in the galaxy. Feeling joy and purpose again. Inside the sanctuary, the new Dracovian had already arrived. She was scared, her scales pale with stress, huddled in a transport crate. A woman stood nearby, another veteran named Beth who'd been working with the program for 2 months. She looked at Jack hopefully. "I'd like to try," Beth said quietly. "If that's okay. I think we might be good for each other." Jack nodded. "Take your time. Let her come to you. Remember, trust has to be earned, not forced." He watched as Beth slowly approached the frightened Dracovian, speaking softly, moving carefully. It was the same process that had started everything. One human, one creature, and the possibility of connection that could change both their lives. Ember landed beside Jack, and he scratched the ridge above her eyes the way she liked. She rumbled contentedly, a sound that still amazed him every time he heard it. This massive predator, this creature that should have been dangerous and wild, was his family. His friend. His reason for getting up every morning. The galaxy had taken notice of what humans could do. How they could look at the strange and alien and see not something to fear, but someone to understand. How they could take their own brokenness and turn it into healing for others. How simple acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways no one expected. Jack Miller had stumbled into a cave 6 months ago expecting to find nothing but another reminder of how cold and hostile the universe could be. Instead, he'd found 3 small lives that needed him. And in saving them, they'd saved him right back. As he stood in the sanctuary surrounded by Dracovians and the humans who loved them, watching Beth slowly earn the trust of a frightened creature, Jack finally understood something important. He hadn't survived the war by accident. He hadn't lived while his friends died because the universe was cruel or random. He'd survived because there was still work to do, still lives to touch, still purpose to find. And sometimes that purpose came in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes it had scales and wings. Sometimes it chirped and trilled instead of speaking words. Sometimes it looked nothing like you and came from a world you didn't understand. But it was real. It was meaningful. And it was worth every single step of the journey that had brought him here. Jack smiled as he watched the new Dracovian cautiously sniff Beth's extended hand. This was just the beginning. For Beth, for the Dracovian, for all the broken souls who would walk through these doors looking for a reason to hope again. And Jack would be here for all of them, with Ember, Storm, and Blaze by his side, ready to show them that healing was possible. That connection could be found in the strangest places. That sometimes the most alien creatures could teach you what it truly meant to be human.